This program is brought to you by RTS on iTunes U from the Distance Education Department of Reformed Theological Seminary. For more information on RTS degrees and programs, please visit us at www.rts.edu or call 1-855-854-6920.
There's some other things here in your outline. His view of Revelation. Predictably, a revelation is not communication of information by the word, but an event that places me in a new situation. Remember Bart saying that revelation is salvation and salvation is revelation. Same thing for Bultmann here, but rather somewhat different concept of it. The importance of revelation is not its content, but the fact that God speaks it. It's always an event in the present. It's the presence of God himself, creating in the hearer a new self-understanding, creating in the hearer authentic existence. Bultmann also makes a sharp distinction between history and Geschichte, but of course he's much more skeptical about biblical history than Bart is. Okay, Paul Tillich. You see his dates there. Died in 1965. His background, very close to Bultmann. Bultmann was one of Tillich's teachers, by the way. He speaks at one point of my very great teacher, Rudolf Bultmann. And Tillich agrees with Bultmann, so on most everything. Bultmann, of course, is a biblical scholar, and Tillich is more of a philosophical theologian, so they cover different territories, but for the most part they agree with one another. Bultmann, of course, very, very negative, very skeptical about biblical history. Tillich follows Bultmann in that respect, also very skeptical about biblical history. He left Europe. He taught in Germany for some time, but he left in the 30s when Hitler came to power, and he came to the United States, taught at Union Theological Seminary in New York for some years, and then went on to teach at Harvard University for the rest of his life. He wrote works in Germany, in German, some of which have not been translated. His main writings, though, are in English. I don't know whether he wrote them in English or whether he got them translated before they were published, but anyway, he wrote a great many articles and books in English, which are very well known, particularly his systematic theology, which is 3 volumes, but actually in 5 parts, and I'll try to explain that to you in a little bit. Theology on page 120. He says there are 2 formal criteria for theology. First, the object of theology is what concerns us ultimately. Only those propositions are theological which deal with their object insofar as it can become a matter of ultimate concern for us. That's important for Tillich, a subjective criterion. Theological statements are statements which we ultimately care about. We care about them more than anything else. And that goes with Tillich's definition of faith, too. For Tillich, faith is ultimate concern. So to have faith is to have faith in God, is to say that God is my ultimate concern, the thing that's most important to me, the thing that I'm going to live my life for. To define ultimate concern, statement B, our ultimate concern is that which determines our being or non-being. Only those statements are theological, which deal with their object insofar as it can become a matter of being or non-being for us. So this ties in with existentialism a little bit, that says the issue in human life is death. The issue of human life is being or non-being, life or death for us. And Tillich says that's what theology is all about. Theology is about what is a matter of life or death, what is a matter of being or non-being, what is the most important thing that we can be concerned about. Well, he distinguishes theology from philosophy and talks about the sources of theology and the material norm, the rationality of theology. Number 6 is one thing that Tillich is famous for. It's called the method of correlation. Tillich says that theology makes an analysis of the human situation out of which the existential questions arise, that is, the questions of life and death. And it demonstrates that the symbols used in the Christian message are the answers to those questions. It's interesting. Symbols are the answers. He doesn't say that the Bible gives answers in the form of statements. The Bible gives answers in the form of symbols, and usually we don't think of symbols as answering anything. If you're going to answer a question, you have to give me a statement. But for Tillich, it's the symbols that give the answer to the questions that come out of our existential situation. There's a mutual dependence between the question and the answer. The answer cannot be derived from the question. The answer comes from revelation. But nevertheless, in form, the answer is dependent upon the structure of the question. Tillich opposes inadequate methods of theology. First, the supranaturalistic. Now, he's always talking about this. This is the way he talks about fundamentalism or orthodox theology or evangelicalism, anything that any kind of traditional Christian orthodoxy. He describes it as supranaturalistic. Now, usually when he talks about these, he caricatures them, and this is what I think he does here. He says that supranaturalistic method, that is the method of orthodoxy, takes Christianity to be a sum of revealed truths fallen from heaven like strange bodies from a strange world. I don't think that's true of most evangelicalism. I don't think that's true with the Reformed theology as we teach it here at RTS, but this is the way it looked to Tillich, okay? So that's the supranaturalistic method. Then there's the naturalistic method, which derives the Christian message from man's questions. That would be like saying, well, forget about the gospel, let's follow Heidegger, okay? And then there's the dualistic approach, which he identifies with Roman Catholicism, which builds a supernatural structure upon a natural substructure. So the questions come from Aristotle, and then there's a supplement that comes from Roman Catholic theology. Now, there are 5 parts to Tillich's systematic theology. And each part starts with an existential question and gives an answer from the Christian symbols. So part 1 is reason and revelation. The question is, how is reason to function? What are the limitations of reason? What are the powers of reason? What can we know by reason? What can't we know by reason? These are the existential questions. The symbol from the Christian faith that gives the answer is revelation, okay? Not the doctrine of revelation, but the symbol of revelation, which gives Tillich a lot of wiggle room there, okay? So reason and revelation. The second part is being and God, okay? Being is the question, God is the answer. The third part, existence. Again, keep in mind how the term existence is used in existentialism. Part 3, existence and the Christ. Part 4, life and the Spirit. And Part 5, history and the kingdom of God. So it's really kind of a traditional scheme of organization. It's Trinitarian. Before the Trinity, in a prefatory way, there's a discussion of revelation. But then you have a section on God, a section on Christ, a section on the Holy Spirit, and then a section on eschatology, the last things, the kingdom of God, where is history going, all of that kind of question. So that's the structure of Tillich's systematic theology. I'll take you through a little bit of this. If you look at page 121, section C, this is reason and revelation. And he starts off by talking about the structure of reason. He distinguishes between ontological reason and technical reason, subjective reason, the depth of reason. The depth is a very important concept in Tillich. It's sort of like, when you're working on a problem, you might find a superficial answer here, a superficial answer there, but you're not satisfied, and you keep working on it, and you keep studying, and then suddenly the light dawns, the penny drops, as they say, and you say, man, now I've got it. Now I understand. Now I know. And that doesn't happen very often, but that happens occasionally as you study things and you work on problems and difficulties. And every now and then you say, I've really got something significant here. And that, I think, is what Tillich talks about when he speaks about the depth of reason, the depth of knowledge. That when you get to the depth of things, that's when you're getting to God, okay? God is the depth. He's being itself. He's the ground and the abyss. He's the great mystery. He's truth itself, being itself, justice itself. And when you may be talking about justice. Okay, this is just, this is unjust, this is more just than that, so on and so forth. But every now and then you'll see an example, you'll see a treatise, and you'll say, man, you nailed it. That really is justice. That's justice as justice ought to be. So the structure of reason. And then he talks about reason as fallen, and page 122, the nature of knowledge. And then the nature of revelation. He distinguishes between revelation as miracle, and he has his own definition of that. It's not what you might expect, but revelation is mystery, it's ecstasy, and it's miracle. So often Tillich divides his categories into threes, kind of like Hegel. And then media of revelation, knowledge of revelation, final revelation. Now, what is a final revelation? This is kind of the depth of it all. This is when we say, man, now I'm really in touch with God. God has really revealed himself to me. And what is that final revelation? The final revelation is a revelation that is united to the ground of being without separation, without disruption, and therefore transparent to the mystery. Remember, God is the ground of being. Therefore, revelation, this final revelation, can negate himself without losing himself. Every medium of revelation occurs in a finite situation. It must negate its finite aspect. In negating its finitude, it overcomes finitude. So here he set up a kind of a criterion for final revelation, the highest revelation, the ultimately satisfying revelation, the depth of revelation. And it's a revelation which is transparent to God, but it's also a revelation which is able to negate itself without losing itself. Now, most revelations, they fall down. I mean, at some point, they have to admit, I am false. I am not transparent to the ultimate. But here we have a revelation that can negate itself without losing itself. The content of this final revelation is the revelation of Jesus as the Christ. Jesus avoided all temptations to claim ultimacy. He sacrificed himself on the cross, negating himself. Therefore, he liberates us from the authority of everything finite in him, his conditioned worldview, and so on. He sacrifices what is merely Jesus to his transparency to God. Now, I think what Tillich is saying, I mean, there's a lot of technical terminology here that I haven't given you because I don't want to take the time, but Jesus is the highest revelation, the final revelation, the revelation in depth. Why? Because he negates himself. Remember how Hegel said that the truth comes by negation and transcendence. You get an idea and then you negate it, and you see that there's some truth in the opposite idea, and that leads you to a higher idea. Jesus negates himself. Jesus says, I am the Messiah, I am the Lord, but at the same time he's a man, and so he's not the Messiah, he's not the Lord. And so he has to admit that, and he has to take a humble role. And his humility extends so far to the cross. And the cross is a self-negation. The cross is the principle of self-negation writ large. And so Jesus, by dying on the cross, Jesus negates himself. And in negating himself, he shows that God is really God and becomes the truest and the final revelation. You see what Tillich is about here. The second part of the systematic theology is called Being and God. Tillich denies that God is a being. Rather, he wants to insist that God is the ground of being. And so he also says that God is being itself. Now remember, Thomas Aquinas did that, basing his idea on Exodus 3:14. So there is some basis for this in the history of theology, to call God being and to identify God with being. But Tillich brings in a lot of philosophical concepts here that probably have very little relationship to Scripture. I would like to share this with you. Number 10 on page 128. This is the God beyond God. Faith, remember, according to Tillich, is ultimate concern. And God is a word that can be applied to any object of ultimate concern, whether it's appropriate or not. If it's not appropriate, of course, you say that it's a false God. You say that it's an idol. Faith, in Tillich's view, is inseparable from doubt. Since it seeks the depth of being, it renounces all objective certainty. The depth of being is something far deeper than any kind of objective certainty. So true faith, says Tillich, can be discerned in a really passionate doubt. Now, you remember how Kierkegaard said that you're really not praying to God unless you're passionate about it. You're really, you may as well be praying to an idol if you're just doing it for show, if you're just doing it out of tradition. But if you're to pray to the real God, needs to be passionate. And Tillich wants to say something like that too. But he wants to say, and he wants to say that that if you pray with really passionate doubt, that is, if you're an atheist, but you really care about your atheism, and you're really emotionally caught up in your atheism, then you are ultimately concerned. And if you're ultimately concerned, you have faith. And if you're ultimately concerned, then of course your prayer is a prayer toward a kind of God. So Tillich says that true faith, perhaps the most profound faith, exists as the courage to be, the courage to affirm being without seeing anything concrete which would conquer the non-being in fate and death. This is absolute faith, which says yes, even though there is no special power that conquers guilt. See, if you pray and you don't believe that anybody's hearing you, but you cry out anyway, that is true faith. This faith, says Tillich, does not overcome anxiety and meaninglessness. We often say that about God. We say that God overcomes our anxiety, God overcomes our thinking that everything is meaningless, and so on. Tillich says, no, it's this passion, which may be a passion for atheism. This faith does not overcome anxiety and meaningless, but it is, quote, the courage to take the anxiety of meaninglessness upon oneself. Okay, here's somebody who passionately says everything is meaningless. I don't know, maybe he uses Ecclesiastes as a proof text there. He says everything is meaningless, and I affirm meaninglessness. And that is true faith, according to Tillich. The object of such faith is a God, quote, above the God of theism, who emerges, quote, when the traditional symbols have lost their power. Okay? So you don't believe anymore in the gospel, you don't believe in the Bible, you don't believe in the bread and the wine, you don't believe in the cross, you don't even, although Tillich thinks the cross is a very powerful symbol, but say you don't even believe in that, you don't believe in any of the traditional symbols of Christ, they just have no claim on you. But when you have this passionate doubt, you're reaching God at a certain level. This is a God above the God of theism. Remember, Nietzsche said that God is dead. A lot of people can't believe in God in the modern period. Well, when you embrace that fact, when you embrace meaninglessness, you're showing the courage to be. And he says the courage to be is rooted in the God who appears when God, that is the God of the Bible, the traditional God, when God has disappeared in the anxiety of doubt. Let me give you that again. The courage to be is rooted in the God who appears when God has disappeared in the anxiety of doubt. Well, this is essentially the same concept of God that you find in Tillich's systematic theology, although in the systematic theology it's dolled up with a little bit more orthodox terminology. Okay, I'm going to move on from there to page 136. You see this is called the New Hermeneutic, all right, the New Hermeneutic. These are post-Bultmannian thinkers. These are people who are students of Bultmann, as Tillich was also, but Tillich was much more philosophical in his orientation. The New Hermeneutic people are more oriented toward biblical studies, as Bultmann himself was. And you see the names there, Gerhard Abling, Ernst Fuchs, James M. Robinson, Robert Funk, and others. This group has a broader understanding of hermeneutic. Hermeneutic, of course, is usually defined as interpretation. When you study hermeneutics in seminary, usually you're studying how to interpret the Bible. Traditionally, hermeneutics teaches the rules and techniques for interpreting texts. And, of course, biblical texts are the most important for theology. So that's what biblical hermeneutics is. But philosophy has developed the concept of hermeneutics in a somewhat different direction. Martin Heidegger, and you see how important Heidegger is to all of this. Heidegger, building on some suggestions of Schleiermacher and Dilthey, suggests a somewhat more comprehensive notion of hermeneutics, not only the interpretation of language, but the interpretation of reality through language. So hermeneutics is a way of interpreting the world. Hermeneutics, in this sense, is kind of a synonym for philosophy, or kind of a synonym for epistemology, if you will. It's very broad. For one thing, language, says Heidegger, is itself interpretation. So it's not just a matter of interpreting language, but it's recognizing that when people speak language, they are interpreting reality. And to understand language is to understand reality in this way, to understand reality through language. So the goal for us is to let reality itself speak to us by means of language, and hermeneutics in the traditional sense is a means toward that larger goal. So language is rightly understood only when by means of language there is an existential encounter between the hearer and reality. Now, the new hermeneutic thinkers are basing their thought on the later Heidegger rather than the early Heidegger. And if you remember from our talk about Heidegger, the later Heidegger moves into a somewhat more mystical phase where he's not so much concerned about interpreting the world, interpreting language, interpreting human nature, human Dasein, as he calls it. But in his later phase, he's more concerned about getting rid of the barriers, getting rid of the things that obstruct our vision of reality. Let reality through. Let reality speak to you. Let reality reveal itself to you. And here the philosopher has a somewhat more passive stance. Let the world speak to me. And language then is not so much a tool we use, but language is something we listen to. So that through language the world will speak to us. Being will speak to us. So, but how does that happen? Well, it happens through a kind of existential encounter between the individual and reality. So interpretation ought not to be objective and neutral. It's not a scientific kind of endeavor where you take certain rules and you apply them to the work of getting some information, but rather it's a matter of leaving yourself open. It's almost like getting ready to listen to revelation. So it's not objective or neutral. You come to the text with a pre-understanding. That's Bultmann. Bultmann said Bultmann said that exegesis without presuppositions is impossible. We always bring our presuppositions. We always bring our assumptions. We always bring our baggage to the text. And of course, for Van Til, presupposition was Christian theism. For Rudolf Bultmann, the presupposition was the modern worldview. But Bultmann says, just bring your pre-understanding, whatever it is. It doesn't matter what worldview you have. Just bring that and let the voice of being come through and call those presuppositions into question. The new hermeneutic believes in something that they called Sach critique. This is their attitude toward the Bible. Bultmann, of course, was famous for demythologization. That is, trying to read the Bible without myth, trying to read the Bible without these stories of supernatural intervention and so on. The new hermeneutic people see themselves as even more radical than that. So they saw themselves as taking a critical approach to all the contents of Scripture, not only the mythological stories, but the theology as well, the view of God and everything. And of course, they insisted that you come to the Bible without assuming the supernatural. In fact, with anti-supernatural assumptions to eliminate any kind of external grounding for faith. The new hermeneutic writers talked about the so-called language event. When you're reading the Bible, think of its language not as propositional. Now remember, all these guys, all these theologians oppose propositional revelation, and that's understandable because their chief principle is human intellectual autonomy. They don't want God telling us what to believe. But it's interesting, they all oppose propositional revelation. They all oppose God, the idea of God telling us what to believe. And they all do it for they reject propositional revelation for different reasons. The Enlightenment rationalists, frankly, say that human reason has to be the final authority, and that's inconsistent with propositional revelation. Same for Kant. Schleiermacher said we can't have propositional revelation because revelation is through feelings. Ritschl said we can't have propositional revelation because revelation is through value judgments. Barth says we can't have propositional revelation because revelation is something in Geschichte which comes upon us and causes a crisis to us. With Bruner, you can't have propositional revelation because revelation is always personal and propositions are always impersonal. And of course, Paul Tillich, Rudolf Bultmann and Paul Tillich, you obviously can't have propositional revelation with them. And that's the same for these Bultmann disciples, which we're calling the new hermeneutic people. They maintain then that revelation can't be propositional because it's this non-propositional, almost mystical experience of waiting to hear what being has to say to me. The language event, not information, but the communication of God Himself as a person. And revelation creates a new understanding. They like to say, we don't interpret the Word interprets us. And, there's some truth in that, but, in theology, don't go by slogans, because every slogan can have a good meaning and a bad meaning at the same time. The language event is something that happens again and again as we read the Bible. It's not so much the communication of meaning as it is a communication of power. It's a transformation of life. And then in proclamation, this language event becomes the Word again, kind of like Karl Barth. So the Word opens us to new ways of thinking and opens us to consider the possibilities in the future. We'll talk more about that when we get to Bultmann. That becomes very important to Bultmann. Well, these disciples of Bultmann, perhaps surprisingly, because they see themselves as very, very radical Bible critics, but another part of their idea is what became called the new quest for the historical Jesus. Now, the old quest was the quest of ritual and Hermann and Harnack, to seek a biography of Jesus through critical historical study. Now, of course, they weren't going to build their theology on this. For ritual, they don't build their theology on historical facts. They build their theology on value judgments that are derived from historical study. But in the old quest, they wanted to have some kind of an objective historical understanding of who Jesus was. And the Jesus they discover becomes a kind of example to us, or a kind of archetype for us. Now, the old quest was basically stymied by Albert Schweitzer and Johannes Weiss, who basically took the view that historical study reveals a Jesus who was an apocalyptic visionary, who thought that the world was just on the brink of coming to an end, and who devised a kind of ethic for people who were only going to live a few years waiting for the kingdom. And that's the Sermon on the Mount. Schweitzer and Weiss said, therefore, that Jesus' teaching, Jesus' ethics, Jesus' example did not have any ongoing relevance for us today. That was the end of the old quest, and the door was open for people like Barth and Brunner, who wanted to base their theology on something other than a historical understanding of the historical Jesus. But now in the 50s, these students of Bultmann, Abeling and Fuchs and so on, want to have a new quest. And where does this come from? Well, Bultmann, you remember, reduced most all of the New Testament to the category of myth, but not quite all of it. He did believe in a somewhat traditional God. Okay, the concept of God is not mythical, according to Bultmann. And he also believed that there was a person named Jesus who lived about the same time that Scripture describes him as living, and who had an awful big impact on certain disciples of his, who went on and preached the existentialist gospel of Heidegger. Okay, there's something that's important about the historical Jesus for Bultmann. He believed that Jesus lived. He believed that Jesus taught. And he believed that Jesus was crucified. He didn't believe in the atonement, didn't believe in the resurrection, but he believed in those things at least. He used to say, we know that Jesus existed. We know the Das, but we don't know much about how he existed. We don't know what he was. We know the Das, but we don't know the Was, okay? Well, some of Bultmann's disciples, particularly Käsemann and Bornkamm, were unsatisfied with that dichotomy between the that and the how, and so they wanted to learn more about the historical Jesus. Bultmann was always talking about the kerygma, the preaching, but the preaching focused on Jesus. So what is there about Jesus that is important for our existentialized faith? Well, and why him rather than somebody else? So the new hermeneutic figures follow this new quest, trying to find something more about the historical Jesus. How is the new quest different from the old quest? Well, the new quest is not interested in a biography of Jesus. They think that's impossible, and they reject the goal of objective historiography, which was the goal of, for example, Harnack. But the New Testament seeks, they think, positively to show us how Jesus can be understood in faith. And so we come to know the historical Jesus by understanding the New Testament language event in faith. That is, it's basically a theological task, not a technical historical task. It's a task of finding where Jesus fits in the kerygma, in the proclamation. Why is Jesus important here? And that's known as the new quest. Now, around 1970, 1980 or so, people were saying that the new quest was dead, and people started talking about a third quest, and that's associated with people like James Dunn and N.T. Wright and so on. You can read about that. I may say something about that later on, but basically I think this is a narrative that will be continued in your New Testament courses. But anyway, just keep in mind that there are these three quests of the historical Jesus, and these guys are struggling to find out where Jesus fits in, you know. I mean, if you've got a gospel that amounts to secular existentialism, how does that have anything to do with Jesus? Or if you've got a gospel like Tillich's that is basically a philosophical system dealing with being and existence and all that, where does Jesus fit in? Well, for Tillich, Jesus was kind of a symbol, and Jesus was a symbol of self-negation. He gave his life in order to affirm his life, kind of a dialectical thing. But that's not very persuasive. And so these people are really struggling. They've allowed their liberal theological prejudices to take them so far that they've gotten to a point where there's really no more room for Jesus in Christian theology. Amazing enough, but that's actually what seems to have happened among these thinkers. I do want to say a little bit about something really anomalous called Christian atheism. This was a theological movement that was famous for about 15 minutes in 1967. I joke with you, but it's sort of like that almost. There was a Time magazine cover that was all black and said, "Is God dead?" And then the Time magazine story went through these thinkers who were claiming to be Christians, claiming to be Christian theologians, but they claimed that in some sense God was dead. As I say, it didn't last for very long, but it kind of shows you the extreme to which theology has gotten. Now, I told you that for the most part, the history of liberal theology is a history of conservative drift. But we're in the middle of a glitch we're in the middle of an exception, a massive exception to the conservative drift. And Bultmann was a major exception to it. Tillich was a major exception to it. And then the extreme of Christian atheism, people actually claiming to be atheists but claiming to be Christians at the same time. And then we'll talk about secular theology also as this glitch in the conservative drift. After that, things start to settle down and we get more conservative-sounding theologies again. But understand what happens. I mean, Bultmann comes along saying, I don't believe this, I don't believe in that, I don't believe in that. Tillich says, I don't believe in this, I don't believe in that. I mean, Tillich says he's not even sure. He doesn't want to say that God exists because, and then he gives this real philosophical explanation for it. He says that if I say that God exists, then that would mean his existence is estranged from his being, and that can't be true. Anyway, you know, here are these people denying this and denying that, and it all almost seemed, and wondering where Jesus fits in, you know, and it almost seems like it's just a matter of time before someone will say, well, maybe God doesn't exist either. I mean, maybe the Bible is wrong when it says that there's a God. Why not? I mean, Nietzsche said that God was dead. Why shouldn't we follow Nietzsche in that direction too, as we followed him in so many other ways? God is dead. Well, what's that all about? As I say here in the notes, sort of a theological flash in the pan, but an instructive one. It does help us to see the logical implications of the earlier theology of the 20th century. The transcendence-immanence dialectic. Remember that? Remember the rectangular diagram where there's transcendence in the top corners and immanence in the lower corners, and then on the right-hand side of the rectangle, there's a non-Christian understanding of divine transcendence and divine immanence. Namely, God is so transcendent that we can't have anything to do with him, and God is so immanent that he can't be distinguished from the world that he's made. Well, both this false transcendence and this false immanence really imply atheism. If you believe that God is so transcendent that he can have no relation to us, then you really, for practical purposes, have no God at all. The extreme of that transcendence principle is atheism, that God is so far removed from us that we can't take account of him at all in our lives, and how can we even confess his existence? We can't, because we say things exist only when we have some access to them, and we don't have any access to God. Or if you go the immanence route, you say, well, God doesn't exist because God is not distinguishable from the world, and a God who's not distinguishable from the world isn't God at all in the biblical sense. So the transcendence-immanence dialectic, and we've seen that over and over again among these theologians. Think of Barth's Geschichte und Historie. Its view of transcendence relegates God to a position where he can have no intelligible relations with the universe, and the immanence pole identifies God with the universe and thus destroys his divinity. Now, this scheme fits all the theologians discussed so far, except for the pre-Kantian Orthodox and possibly Kierkegaard. And it's interesting that the Christian atheists were all students of people like Bultmann and Tillich and Barth. Okay, even Barth was important to them, and they gave credit to Bultmann and Tillich and Barth. Bultmann's demythologization was important. They just decided that the Christian atheists decided that God was just as mythological as the angels are. Tillich's God beyond the God of theism, the God who appears when you have a really passionate atheist faith. Well, that's so you can understand how Christian atheism comes out of that. You don't really need God. All you need is a passion about being and non-being. Then top of 139, Bonhoeffer. I'll say more about him in a little bit. Bonhoeffer, in his later work, speaks of a non-religious way of relating to God, living in a world with an unbelieving population, as if God doesn't exist, living with them in order to serve them and not to try to rule over them. And then Barth's God who becomes his opposite, his own opposite, God who negates himself. The God whom we can't define, the God who doesn't reveal himself in any rational kind of way. Well, and Tillich's doctrine of divine self-negation. Well, the Christian atheists gave credit to all these people. Well, there's Thomas Altizer, first of all, who is probably the most famous. Well, let's keep going here. Altizer's argument precisely parallels the transcendence-immanence dialectic. Christian atheism also serves as a bridge to other secular theologies and theologies of liberation. We'll talk more about that. Because it's willing to accept the authority of secular thought in a way more than the theologians we've considered up until now. But Christian atheism didn't have a lasting importance. You won't find people writing today who are Christian atheists. And the lack of lasting influence, I think, is due to the conservative drift that we've seen in those theologies that have made the most impact. Lasting influence for a theologian, no matter how liberal he is, requires at least some lip service to a biblical and theological rhetoric, respectful handling of the full range of Christian doctrine. Now, we see that in Barth. Whatever we may think of Barth, certainly he was respectful of the traditional faith and of the Bible. But, of course, after Barth, there's this glitch in the conservative drift. And so I think that people like Bultmann and Tillich and the new Hermeneutic and the Christian atheists and so on will have very little influence on theology going forward. Just a little bit about Altizer, who's, again, quite unimportant, but I think he's sort of interesting. Altizer opposes the concept of God as an unchanging substance. He insists that God is able to become the opposite of himself. God is able to become other than himself. And, of course, that's what Barth said. Altizer also says that he believes in a fully kenotic Christ. Now, kenotic theology is the idea that when Jesus became incarnate, he set aside his divine attributes to some extent or other. And so that when he was on earth, he was not fully God. He was perhaps had some powers of God, but not all powers of God, because he'd set aside his divine attributes. Now, Altizer, of course, generally the church rejects this. Evangelicalism rejects kenoticism. But with Altizer embraces kenoticism, and he wants to take it to an extreme. He says that he believes in a fully kenotic Christ. That is, when God became incarnate in Christ, that is God, even God the Father relinquished his divine attributes, experienced death, and therefore annihilated himself so that there is no God anymore. Okay? So the incarnation is an event in which God canceled himself out. Kind of similar to Paul Tillich here. But you see how it results in the death of God. There is no resurrection. There is no ascension to heaven. God's death is permanent. Yet, says Altizer, there's something good about this. There's a dialectic here. Out of the negative comes something positive. God's death gives liberty to man, opening the way to us to fulfill ourselves. And that is realized eschatology, he says. So here in Altizer, he denies the transcendence of God, rejects the supernatural, rejects absolutes, particularism, static concepts, sympathy for Oriental monism. Hamilton, another Christian atheist, is less interesting, I would say, than Altizer. Altizer has this kind of almost Hegelian dialectic of God negating himself and so on. Hamilton is more common sense. Hamilton just says, look, modern men live with science and technology, and that development is irreversible, and human beings really today, living in the modern world, can't take the old concept of God seriously, and so they need to learn to live without God. Yes, he says it is right to wait for God, that is, to wait for the idea of God to reappear in some other form, but there's no point in believing in God today.
The preceding program has been brought to you by RTS on iTunes U and may not be reproduced or disseminated in part or in whole for sale or for profit without express written consent. For more information on RTS degrees and programs, please visit us at www.rts.edu or call 1-855-854-6920.